They called her a washout the moment she walked into the Meridian Regional Aviation Authority building. They said she probably couldn't handle a paper airplane, let alone anything with an engine. The desk clerk rolled her eyes at her application, and the flight examiner pointed to her twice-failed certification records and said, "You think persistence makes up for talent?" It didn't matter to them that she'd spent every spare dollar on simulator time. Because then Captain Raymond Thorne from Emergency Response Command walked through those doors, took one look at the flight wings pinned quietly to her jacket lapel, and stopped the entire room dead in its tracks. Those weren't just any wings. And she wasn't just another hopeful pilot chasing impossible dreams. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She was the reason 200 passengers on Transwest Flight 847 ever saw their families again. Want to know what those wings really meant and why the whole aviation office went silent when they realized who she actually was? First, smash that subscribe button and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our aviation family across the globe. Now, let's dive into the most incredible story of determination and heroism you've probably never heard. The Meridian Regional Aviation Authority, building squatted on the outskirts of Clearwater Municipal Airport like a bureaucratic fortress designed to crush dreams. Built sometime in the early 90s, it wore its age poorly scuffed linoleum floors that had seen too many disappointed candidates walk across them. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look either jaundiced or defeated. And that particular smell that all government buildings seem to share, a mixture of industrial coffee, photocopier toner, and the accumulated anxiety of thousands of people whose futures had been decided within these walls. The waiting area featured rows of orange plastic chairs that had been uncomfortable when they were new and had only gotten worse with time. Aviation magazines from 3 years ago sat scattered across metal tables, their pages dog-eared by nervous hands seeking distraction from the weight of their circumstances. Near the far wall, a faded poster displayed the inspiring image of a commercial airliner soaring through cotton-white clouds, accompanied by text that read, "Your dreams take flight here," a slogan that felt increasingly ironic given the building's primary function as a place where dreams came to die. She sat in the third row from the front, close enough to hear her name when called, but far enough back to observe without drawing attention. Late 20s, maybe 30 at most, with the kind of focused stillness that came from years of studying flight manuals and weather patterns instead of socializing. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, no makeup beyond what might help her look more professional, and clothes that were clearly her best attempt at serious pilot candidate. A navy blazer that had seen better days, pressed khakis, and black shoes polished to military precision despite never having been issued by any military dot in her hands. A leather portfolio held the weight of her aviation dreams. Inside were copies of her previous test scores, letters of recommendation from flight instructors who believed in her despite the official failures, and a logbook documenting every single hour she'd spent in cockpits, both real and simulated. The edges of the portfolio were worn smooth from handling, creased from the 2 previous times she'd carried it into this exact building with hope and left with rejection. But today felt different. Not because she'd suddenly become a different person, or because her flying skills had magically improved overnight, but because she'd finally stopped caring what anyone in this building thought about her qualifications. She'd already proven to herself what she could do when it mattered. The question was whether the Meridian Regional Aviation Authority was ready to acknowledge what should have been obvious from the moment she'd submitted her latest application. The small crowd of other applicants around her carried the nervous energy of people whose entire futures hung on the decisions that would be made in the next few hours. A young man in the front row kept checking his watch every 30 seconds, as if time might somehow move faster under observation. A woman 2 seats to her left was quietly reviewing flashcards, mouthing aviation terminology like prayers. Another candidate near the window stared out at the runway where small training aircraft practiced touch-and-go landings, probably imagining himself at the controls. None of them had failed the commercial pilot's examination twice. None of them had been told by 3 different examiners that they lacked the natural instincts for commercial aviation. None of them had spent the last 18 months working as a ground crew coordinator just to stay close to aircraft, watching other pilots, some with half her skill and a fraction of her dedication, receive the certifications that continued to elude her. And absolutely none of them had spent 73 minutes last month flying through the worst storm system to hit the Pacific Northwest in a decade, navigating by instruments alone through zero visibility conditions, communicating with air traffic control through radio static that would have panicked most veteran pilots, all while keeping 200 terrified passengers calm enough to follow emergency procedures that saved every single life aboard an aircraft that should have become a statistic. But that's exactly what the worn wings pinned to her jacket represented. Not the commercial pilot's license she'd failed to earn twice. Not the approval of bureaucrats who measured competence through written examinations and standardized flight patterns. Something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that when everything went wrong at 35,000 feet, when experienced pilots would have frozen or panicked, when the book said there were no good options left, she'd found a way to bring everyone home. The question was whether anyone in the Meridian Regional Aviation Authority building was about to figure that out. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Meridian Regional Aviation Authority existed in that peculiar space between hope and bureaucracy, where dreams of flight met the grinding machinery of federal regulation. The building itself seemed designed by someone who'd never seen an airplane but had strong opinions about proper documentation procedures. Concrete walls painted in government issue. Beige rose to meet a drop ceiling that had been white sometime during the Bush administration, the first one. Water stains mapped mysterious geography across acoustic tiles that absorbed sound with the efficiency of wet cardboard. The air conditioning system wheezed through its cycles with mechanical emphysema, pushing stale air that carried the mingled sense of industrial disinfectant, burnt coffee from a machine that should have been replaced during the Clinton years, and something that might have been hope if hope had a smell, which in this place it did. It smelled like nervous sweat and photocopier toner. Fluorescent lights hummed their eternal song overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made healthy people look sick, and sick people look like they were auditioning for zombie movies. The illumination was bright enough to read fine print, but harsh enough to make everyone squint, creating an atmosphere where optimism went to die a slow, bureaucratic death. Along the eastern wall, a series of windows looked out toward the active runway of Clearwater Municipal Airport. Through smudged glass that hadn't been properly cleaned since the airport's last inspection, candidates could watch aircraft practice the very maneuvers they hoped to master professionally. Cessna trainers traced lazy patterns in the morning sky, their engines producing a distant drone that served as a constant reminder of what lay just beyond the paperwork and examinations. The waiting area sprawled across cracked linoleum tiles, in a pattern that had probably been fashionable when disco was still considered cutting-edge music. Orange plastic chairs, molded sometime during the Carter administration, sat bolted to the floor in rigid rows that faced toward a reception desk protected by bulletproof glass, because apparently failed pilot candidates had historically posed enough of a security risk to warrant ballistic protection. Behind the reinforced barrier, government employees moved with the unhurried efficiency of people whose paychecks arrived regardless of how many dreams they crushed on any given Tuesday. File cabinets lined the walls like metal tombstones, each drawer containing the documented aspirations of pilots who'd either succeeded or failed within these walls. The successful ones were filed away and forgotten. The failures were filed away and occasionally referenced as cautionary tales. A bulletin board near the entrance displayed a collection of notices that ranged from inspirational to ominous. Federal aviation regulation updates competed for space, with motivational posters featuring aircraft in various stages of graceful flight. Safety notices reminded candidates about everything that could kill them in an aircraft, while success stories celebrated the few who'd managed to navigate the bureaucratic maze successfully. The acoustic properties of the space meant that conversations at normal volume carried clearly across the room, ensuring that everyone's business became everyone else's entertainment. Whispered consultations between examiners became public speculation. Confident statements became nervous questions when repeated at higher volume than intended. Privacy was as rare as successful commercial pilot certifications. Near the back corner, a vending machine hummed with mechanical contentment, offering stale snacks and caffeinated beverages to candidates who'd forgotten to eat breakfast due to pre-test anxiety. The machine's selection reflected the dietary preferences of people under extreme stress. Candy bars, energy drinks, and packages of crackers that had probably been loaded during the previous decade. The ventilation system moved air with all the enthusiasm of a dying fish, creating pockets of stuffiness that shifted unpredictably throughout the day. By afternoon, the atmosphere would become thick enough to require navigation by instruments, but morning still held the promise of breathable air and manageable stress levels. This was where aviation careers came to be born or buried, where years of training and thousands of dollars in flight instruction either transformed into professional certification or dissolved into expensive disappointment. The building had witnessed countless moments of triumph and devastation, and its walls seemed to retain the emotional residue of every candidate who'd ever walked through its doors. It was the perfect setting for underestimating someone who'd already proven herself in circumstances far more demanding than any examination room could simulate. She sat with the kind of stillness that suggested she'd learned to wait in places where movement might mean discovery. Not the fidgety anxiety of the other candidates, not the nervous energy of people whose futures hung on the next few hours, but the patient alertness of someone who'd waded through far more consequential situations than this. Her breathing was controlled, measured, the rhythm of someone who'd learned that composure wasn't optional when lives depended on clear thinking. Late 20s, maybe pushing 30, with auburn hair pulled back in a functional ponytail that hadn't seen a salon in months but was maintained with military precision. The style was practical rather than fashionable, designed to stay out of her face during long hours spent studying instrument panels and weather maps. No makeup beyond what might help her look professional for today's appointment, and no jewelry, except for a plain digital watch strapped to her left wrist. The timepiece was the kind that pilots wore because it displayed multiple time zones, had a stopwatch function, and could survive the pressure changes of high-altitude flight. Her clothes told a story of careful budgeting and practical priorities. The navy blazer had been pressed for today's visit, but the fabric showed slight wear at the elbows where countless hours of leaning over flight manuals had taken their toll. Dark slacks that fit well but had clearly been purchased for durability, rather than fashion, paired with black leather shoes that had been polished to a mirror, finished despite never having been issued by any military organization. The shine was the kind that came from someone who understood that attention to detail in small things translated to competence in large ones. The leather portfolio balanced perfectly across her knees, worn at the corners from repeated handling, and creased along the edges where nervous fingers had gripped it during previous visits to this exact building. The leather had developed the patina that came from years of careful use, darkened in places where hands had held it during moments of stress and anticipation. Inside, the meticulous organization of someone who'd learned that preparation was often the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Flight logs arranged in chronological order, each entry written in the precise handwriting of someone who understood that sloppy documentation could mean the difference between passing and failing an audit. Test scores that told the story of someone who grasped aviation theory better than most licensed commercial pilots, with marks that would have been impressive if they'd been achieved by candidates who hadn't already failed the practical examination twice. Letters of recommendation from flight instructors who'd watched her handle aircraft with the kind of natural ability that couldn't be taught in any classroom or simulator, but it was her stillness that marked her as different from everyone else in the waiting area. She didn't check her phone every 30 seconds, like the young man in the front row who seemed convinced that time might move faster if monitored more closely. She didn't review flashcards like the woman 2 seats over who was quietly mouthing aviation terminology like prayers to whatever gods watched over aspiring pilots. She didn't stare longingly out the window at the training aircraft, practicing touch-and-go landings like the candidate near the glass who was probably imagining himself at the controls of something larger and more impressive. Instead, she simply existed in this space with complete presence. Her posture was unconsciously perfect, back straight but not rigid, shoulders relaxed but never slouched, hands resting gently on the portfolio without gripping it with white-knuckled anxiety. It was the position of someone who'd spent countless hours in pilot seats, whose body had automatically adapted to the requirements of professional aviation, even if the paperwork hadn't caught up with reality yet. When she did move, every motion was deliberate and economical. Reaching into her jacket pocket for a pen, the movement was smooth and controlled. Adjusting her position in the uncomfortable plastic chair, she shifted with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd learned to find comfort in spaces not designed for human habitation. Turning a page in a manual she'd pulled from her portfolio, her fingers moved with the precision of someone who'd handled important documents in turbulent conditions. Her eyes revealed perhaps the most telling details about who she really was. Beneath the surface appearance of just another pilot candidate, they tracked the movement of aircraft visible through the smudged windows with automatic professional assessment. When a Cessna trainer approached the runway with slightly uneven wings, she noticed. When another aircraft executed a particularly smooth landing despite crosswind conditions, she nodded with barely perceptible approval, the kind of recognition that passed between professionals who understood exactly how difficult certain maneuvers were to perform correctly. The small digital altimeter clipped to her keychain caught light occasionally as she moved, a tool that most recreational pilots didn't bother carrying but that someone who'd flown in challenging conditions would consider essential equipment. Her fingernails were cut short and practical, without polish or decoration that might interfere with the precise manipulation of controls and switches. Even her posture suggested someone accustomed to the confined spaces of cockpits, comfortable in environments where every inch of space served a specific purpose. But it was the wings pinned quietly to her jacket, lapel, that told the real story for anyone who knew how to read them. Not the standard commercial pilot wings that everyone in the room hoped to earn, with their obvious styling and mass-produced appearance. Not decorative pins or promotional items handed out by airline companies at career fairs. These were different, smaller, more discreet, crafted from actual metal rather than cheap alloy or plastic. The kind of wings that weren't available in aviation gift shops and weren't distributed at flight school graduation ceremonies. The metal showed the subtle patina of age and handling, but had been maintained with obvious care. They'd been pinned to her jacket with the attention of someone who understood their significance, cleaned regularly but not polished to showiness, treated with the respect reserved for symbols that represented actual achievement rather than aspirational decoration. The design was understated but precise, with details that became apparent only under close examination, the kind of craftsmanship that suggested they'd been created for a specific purpose by people who understood the difference between authentic recognition, and mere decoration. She wore them positioned where someone who knew what to look for might notice them, but not displayed prominently for general attention or casual recognition. They represented something earned rather than purchased, awarded rather than acquired, and she carried them with the quiet dignity of someone who understood exactly what they meant and why they mattered. No one in the waiting area had bothered to ask about those wings. No one had inquired about her background beyond what appeared on her failed test records, or wondered why someone who'd been unsuccessful twice seemed more composed than candidates facing their first examination. No one had considered that her presence in that room might represent something more complex than simple stubborn persistence in the face of repeated, bureaucratic rejection, and absolutely no one had imagined that the quiet woman with the worn portfolio and the carefully maintained wings had already proven herself capable of things that would have challenged pilots with decades more official experience than she possessed. The call came at exactly 9:30, delivered through a speaker system that had probably been state-of-the-art when Reagan was president. Candidate number 47, Jenna Caldwell, report to examination window 2. The electronic voice carried all the warmth of a funeral announcement, echoing off concrete walls with the efficiency of institutional indifference. She stood without hurry, gathering her portfolio with the same methodical precision she displayed while waiting. No nervous fumbling with papers, no last-minute checks of her appearance in the reflection of the bulletproof glass. Just the smooth, controlled movement of someone who'd prepared for this moment long before walking through the building's front door. The examination window sat behind reinforced glass, thick enough to stop small-caliber bullets, though the greater threat to aspiring pilots came from the bureaucratic weapons wielded by the people on the other side. A metal speaking grill allowed for communication, while a document slot provided the only physical connection between hope and official approval. The setup suggested that failed pilot candidates had historically posed some kind of security risk, though the reality was probably more mundane government employees who'd grown tired of angry confrontations over rejected applications. Behind the barrier sat examiner Patricia Holbrook, a woman in her late 50s who'd spent the last 23 years processing pilot certifications with the enthusiasm of someone assigned to count grains of sand. Her nameplate identified her as senior flight examiner, a title that carried more authority than her actual aviation experience might warrant. The desk around her was organized with obsessive precision, forms arranged in perfect stacks, pens aligned like military formations, and a computer monitor positioned at an angle that suggested she'd rather look at screens than people. Holbrook didn't glance up from her paperwork when Jenna approached. "Application folder," she said, extending her hand through the document slot without making eye contact. The gesture carried the practiced dismissiveness of someone who'd processed thousands of similar requests and found most of them wanting in some fundamental way. Jenna slid her portfolio through the opening, watching as Holbrook opened it with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd performed this exact action countless times before. The examiner's eyes moved across the documents with practiced speed, scanning for the information that would determine whether this appointment would last 5 minutes or 5 hours. Previous examination attempts, Holbrook noted, her voice carrying the flat tone of someone reading grocery lists. Failed written examination October 2023. Failed practical examination January 2024. She looked up for the first time, her expression suggesting that these failures confirmed everything she'd expected to find. Third attempt at commercial certification. "Yes, ma'am," Jenna replied, her voice level and professional despite the examiner's obvious skepticism. Holbrook flipped through the supporting documents with increasing speed, as if hoping to find some obvious disqualification that would end the appointment quickly. Flight logs documenting hundreds of hours in various aircraft types, letters of recommendation from certified flight instructors, medical certifications that exceeded FAA requirements, all the paperwork that suggested someone serious about aviation. rather than someone chasing fantasies. Training completed at ... Holbrook squinted at the documentation. Westbridge Flight Academy. Never heard of it. The statement carried the implication that institutions unknown to Patricia Holbrook probably weren't worth knowing about. Small operation? Regional training facility, Jenna answered without defensiveness. FAA, certified for commercial instruction. I'm sure it is. Holbrook's tone suggested otherwise. She continued flipping through documents, pausing occasionally to make notes on a form that would become part of Jenna's permanent examination record. Each notation seemed designed to document reasons for eventual rejection rather than qualifications for approval. The medical certification drew particular scrutiny. Holbrook examined the documentation as if searching for disqualifying conditions that previous examiners might have missed. Dr. Richardson signed off on your medical clearance, she noted. Another one I don't recognize. Not one of our usual aviation medical examiners. He's certified by the FAA for commercial pilot medical examinations, Jenna replied, maintaining her professional tone despite the obvious implication that her choice of medical examiner somehow reflected poor judgment or corner cutting. Of course he is, Holbrook said, making another note on her form. And these flight hours? Quite a lot of simulator time relative to actual aircraft experience. You understand that simulator hours don't translate directly to real-world flying. Capability? The question was rhetorical, designed to establish Holbrook's expertise while subtly undermining Jenna's qualifications. It was the kind of comment that revealed more about the examiner's assumptions than the candidate's abilities, but it served its intended purpose of establishing the power dynamic that would govern the rest of their interaction. I understand. The difference, Jenna said simply. Holbrook pulled out a thick manual and began referencing specific sections, her finger tracing regulatory text with the devotion of someone who'd memorized federal aviation regulations, but had probably never experienced the practical challenges they were designed to address. According to current certification requirements, candidates who failed previous examinations must demonstrate improved competency through additional training or experience. She looked up from the manual with the expression of someone about to deliver disappointing news. Your documentation shows continued flight training, but I don't see evidence of any significant change in your approach or additional qualifications that would suggest a different outcome from your previous attempts. The statement hung in the air like smoke from a failed engine, carrying implications that went beyond mere regulatory compliance. Holbrook wasn't just questioning Jenna's paperwork, she was questioning her fundamental suitability for commercial aviation, suggesting that someone who'd failed twice probably lacked whatever indefinable quality separated successful pilots from persistent dreamers. I've gained additional experience since my last examination, Jenna replied, her voice remaining steady despite the obvious direction of Holbrook's assessment. Additional experience, Holbrook repeated, her tone suggesting that this claim warranted skepticism. What kind of additional experience? More simulator hours? Weekend flying with instructors who tell you what you want to hear? The questions carried the weight of someone who'd seen too many candidates who confused enthusiasm with competence, who thought that persistence could substitute for natural ability. Holbrook had probably watched hundreds of hopeful pilots convince themselves that more training would somehow transform fundamental limitations into professional qualifications. Real-world flying experience, Jenna said, offering no additional details. Real-world experience. Holbrook made another note this. One longer than the others. And where exactly did you gain this real-world experience? Commercial operations require specific types of experience under particular conditions. Weekend pleasure flights don't typically provide the kind of challenges that prepare pilots for commercial responsibility. The implication was clear. Someone whose official record showed 2 examination failures probably hadn't been entrusted with the kind of significant flying opportunities that would justify a 3rd attempt at certification. Holbrook's worldview apparently couldn't accommodate the possibility that meaningful aviation experience might occur outside the documented pathways she recognized and approved. Various situations, Jenna replied, maintaining her professional composure even as it became obvious that this examination was heading toward the same conclusion as her previous attempts. Holbrook leaned back in her chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd confirmed her initial assessment. 2 failures, training at an unknown school, medical clearance from an unfamiliar doctor, and vague claims about undocumented experience, all the elements that typically preceded a 3rd rejection. Letter. Miss Caldwell, she said, her voice carrying the finality of bureaucratic judgment. I think we need to have a realistic conversation about your aviation career goals. The conversation at the examination window carried clearly through the lobbies. Acoustic dead zones, where privacy was as rare as successful commercial pilot certifications. Every question, every dismissive comment, every skeptical pause in examiner Holbrook's voice became public. Entertainment for the assembled crowd of aspiring pilots who'd arrived early for their own appointments. 3rd time's the charm, right? The voice came from somewhere behind Jenna, male and confident with the particular brand of arrogance that belonged to someone who'd never failed at anything important. That's what they always say, anyway. A woman's voice joined the commentary, carrying the gossipy tone of someone who'd found the morning's most interesting drama. 3rd attempt? I've never heard of anyone needing 3 tries for commercial certification. Most people figure out by the 2nd failure that maybe they're not cut out for professional aviation. The young man in the front row, the one who'd been checking his watch obsessively, turned around to get a better view of the examination window. I heard the practical exam is actually easier the 2nd time because they give you credit for knowing what to expect. If you can't pass it twice, maybe you should consider a different career path. Ground crew work, suggested another candidate. This one an older man with a faded baseball cap that advertised some flight school in Arizona. Nothing wrong with supporting aviation from the ground. Some people are just better at organizing other people's flights than flying themselves. The comments rippled through the waiting area with the enthusiasm of spectators at a sporting event, where the outcome had already been determined. None of them bothered to lower their voices or pretend. They weren't discussing someone who was sitting less than 20 feet away from them. The acoustic properties of the institutional space meant that whispered conversations became public announcements, and public announcements became theatrical performances. Look at her just standing there, observed a woman near the vending machine, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd appointed herself as commentator for the morning's events. No nervousness, no fidgeting. Either she's incredibly confident or she's already given up and just going through the motions. My money's on given up, replied the man next to her. You can tell by the way she's handling this. Someone who actually expected to pass would be more engaged with the process, asking questions, trying to address the examiner's concerns. She's just letting it happen. A younger candidate, probably fresh out of flight school with his commercial certificate still warm from the printer, leaned back in his plastic chair with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced significant failure. I don't understand why people keep trying after 2 failures. There are aptitude tests for a reason. Some people just don't have the natural instincts for commercial aviation. Persistence isn't the same as competence, agreed another voice from the back of the room. Just because you want something badly enough to keep trying doesn't mean you're capable of doing it safely. Commercial aviation isn't about participation trophies. The conversation was beginning to attract attention from airport personnel who worked in adjacent offices. A maintenance supervisor had paused in the hallway outside the waiting area, apparently finding the discussion more interesting than his scheduled inspection duties. 2 administrative assistants from the airport management office had positioned themselves near the bulletin board where they could observe the examination window while pretending to review posted notices. "What I don't understand," said the woman with the flashcards, pausing in her memorization of federal aviation regulations, "is why the system even allows 3 attempts. If you can't demonstrate basic competency in 2 tries, what makes anyone think the 3rd time will be different?" "Money," replied the baseball cap man with the cynical wisdom of someone who'd been around aviation long enough to understand its business aspects. Every examination attempt generates fees. The testing system has a financial incentive to keep letting people try until they either pass or run out of money. "That's pretty harsh," said a voice from near the windows, though the tone suggested. The speaker found the harshness more entertaining than objectionable. "But probably true. I mean, look at her documentation folder. That thing looks like it's been through 3 examination cycles already. How much money has she spent on this dream?" The maintenance supervisor stepped fully into the waiting area, apparently deciding that the morning's entertainment was worth delaying his official duties. "You know what the problem is with people like that?" he asked, gesturing toward the examination window where Jenna continued her conversation with Holbrook. "They watch too many movies about aviation. They think flying is about inspiration and determination instead of technical skill and split-second decision-making. Hollywood aviation," agreed someone else. "All dramatic music and heroic speeches. Nothing about the thousands of hours of training and the mathematical precision required for safe commercial operations." A flight instructor who'd been quietly reviewing his own paperwork finally joined the conversation, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years evaluating pilot candidates. "I've seen this type before. Usually very dedicated. Excellent students in ground school, but something just doesn't click when they get into actual flight situations. Book smart, but not aviation smart. What's the difference?" asked the young candidate with obvious curiosity. "Aviation intelligence is about making correct decisions quickly under pressure, while managing multiple systems simultaneously," the instructor explained. "You can memorize every regulation in the FAA handbook, but if you can't process information fast enough during an emergency, you're dangerous in a commercial cockpit." The conversation was developing its own momentum, feeding on itself as each participant added their expertise to the collective assessment of someone they'd been observing for less than 2 hours. The waiting area had transformed from a collection of individual anxieties into a united audience watching someone else's failure unfold in real time. "She probably tells people she's a pilot," suggested the woman near the vending machine. "You know the type. Talks about flying like she's already certified. Maybe even gives advice to other people who are working toward their licenses." "That's the worst kind," agreed the baseball cap man. "The almost pilots who act like near misses are the same as actual achievement. I've met people who've been almost certified for years, always just one more test away from their commercial license. And they always have excuses," added another voice. "Bad weather during the practical exam, unfair examiners, equipment problems that mysteriously only affect them. Never their fault. Always some external factor that prevented them from demonstrating their obvious competence." The flight instructor nodded with professional agreement. "The successful candidates take responsibility for their performance, good or bad. They analyze their mistakes, get additional training in specific areas, and come back better prepared. The ones who keep failing usually blame everything except their actual flying ability." From the examination window came the sound of papers being shuffled with bureaucratic finality, suggesting that examiner Holbrook was reaching the conclusion that everyone in the waiting area had already anticipated. The conversation died as attention focused on the official pronouncement that would either vindicate their collective judgment or surprise everyone with an unexpected outcome, but no one in that room expected to be surprised. They'd already reached their verdict about the quiet woman with the worn portfolio and the mysterious wings, and they were simply waiting for official confirmation of what seemed obvious to anyone who understood how aviation really worked. Airport Security Chief Wade Morrison, approached the examination window with the measured stride of someone who'd spent 15 years, ensuring that nothing irregular happened on his watch. Late 40s, carrying the soft weight of desk work, but moving with the residual authority of someone who'd once worked more dangerous assignments. His uniform was pressed to regulation standards, complete with patches indicating various security certifications and a radio that crackled occasionally with updates from other airport personnel. Morrison had been monitoring the conversation between Jenna and Examiner Holbrook through the building's security cameras, but the developing commentary from the waiting area had drawn his attention to what appeared to be an unusual situation. 3 examination failures were rare enough to warrant investigation, particularly when the candidate seemed unusually composed, despite obvious bureaucratic hostility. "Excuse me, miss," Morrison said, positioning himself between Jenna and the examination window. His voice carried the practiced neutrality of someone trained to de-escalate situations before they became problems. "I'm Chief Morrison, Airport Security. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Jenna turned from the window where Holbrook was continuing her methodical review of documentation. "Of course," she replied, her tone remaining professional despite the obvious implication that her presence had somehow attracted official security. "Attention!" Morrison's eyes immediately focused on the wings pinned to her jacket lapel, studying them with the intensity of someone trained to recognize potential security threats through unusual or irregular identification. "Those wings you're wearing," he said, leaning slightly closer for a better view. "I don't recognize the design. Are those from a commercial airline?" "No, sir," Jenna answered without elaborating. "Military?" Morrison continued, his training evident in the way he asked questions designed to elicit specific information rather than general responses. "Not exactly." The non-answer clearly frustrated Morrison, who was accustomed to straightforward responses from people questioned about their credentials. His expression shifted from neutral inquiry to professional suspicion, the look of someone who'd encountered too many people trying to misrepresent their qualifications or authority. "Miss, I'm going to need you to be more specific about those wings," Morrison said, his voice taking on the edge that preceded more serious interrogation. "We have strict regulations about unauthorized personnel displaying aviation credentials in this facility. If those represent some kind of official certification, I need to see documentation." The waiting area had gone completely quiet, all previous conversation forgotten as everyone focused on this new development. The morning's entertainment had evolved from passive observation of bureaucratic rejection to active security investigation, raising the stakes considerably for everyone watching. "They're not commercial certification wings," Jenna replied calmly, making no move to remove them or provide additional documentation. Morrison stepped closer, his position now clearly authoritative, rather than conversational. "That doesn't answer my question. If they're not commercial and not military, what exactly do they represent? And why are you wearing them to a commercial pilot certification examination?" Behind the examination window, Holbrook had stopped reviewing paperwork to observe the security interrogation. Her expression suggested that this development confirmed her initial assessment of Jenna as somehow irregular or problematic. The attention from airport security validated her skeptical approach to the examination process. "They represent flight experience," Jenna said, her voice remaining level despite the increasing pressure from Morrison's questioning. "What kind of flight experience?" Morrison demanded. "I've been working airport security for 15 years. And I've never seen wings like those. If you're representing yourself as having some kind of special aviation qualification, I need to verify that information through official channels." The question hung in the air with the weight of official authority challenging potentially fraudulent claims. Morrison had clearly moved beyond casual inquiry into formal investigation, treating Jenna's wings as possible misrepresentation of credentials that could constitute a security violation. They're not meant for verification through normal channels, Jenna replied, maintaining her composure even as the situation escalated beyond simple bureaucratic skepticism into potential accusations of fraud or misrepresentation. Morrison's radio crackled with a routine security update, but he ignored it to focus entirely on what he now perceived as a significant irregularity. "Miss, I'm going to need you to remove those wings and provide proper documentation for any aviation credentials you're claiming to possess. If you can't verify their legitimacy, you'll need to leave the examination area." The threat of removal from the building represented a serious escalation, transforming what had begun as a routine certification appointment into a confrontation with airport security. Everyone in the waiting area understood that they were witnessing someone's aviation dreams, potentially ending not through examination failure, but through accusations of credential fraud. "Chief Morrison," Examiner Holbrook called through the speaking grill, apparently deciding to insert herself into the security investigation. "This candidate has already failed commercial certification twice. Her documentation shows irregular training and questionable experience claims. If there are also issues with fraudulent credentials, that might explain the pattern of examination failures." The public statement from the examiner carried additional weight, providing official support for Morrison's suspicions while simultaneously undermining any remaining credibility Jenna might have possessed. The combination of security investigation and official examiner skepticism created a nearly impossible situation for anyone hoping to salvage their certification prospects. Morrison nodded at Holbrook's assessment, his expression now showing the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been validated by professional authority. "That fits the pattern," he agreed. "People who misrepresent their qualifications usually have trouble passing legitimate examinations." From the waiting area came murmurs of agreement and knowing nods. The earlier commentary about persistence versus competence seemed prescient now that security concerns had emerged. Several candidates exchanged glances that suggested they'd suspected something irregular about the quiet woman, who'd seemed too composed for someone facing a third examination. "Failure. So I'm asking you one more time," Morrison said, his voice now carrying the full authority of someone prepared to escalate the situation to formal enforcement action. "What exactly do those wings represent, and can you provide official documentation proving your right to wear them?" The flight instructor who'd been observing from the waiting area stood up, apparently deciding that his professional expertise might be useful in resolving the security situation. "Chief Morrison," he called out, "if you'd like me to examine those wings, I might be able to identify what organization issued them. I've seen most commercial and military aviation insignia." Morrison gestured for the instructor to approach, clearly welcoming additional expert assessment of what appeared to be increasingly questionable credentials. The situation was rapidly developing into a formal investigation involving multiple aviation professionals, all focused on determining whether the quiet woman with the worn portfolio was guilty of misrepresenting her qualifications. Dr. Kenneth Harwell, the flight instructor, introduced himself to Morrison. "I've been a certified flight instructor for 12 years, and I teach aviation history at Meridian Technical College. I should be able to identify any legitimate aviation wings." Harwell approached Jenna with professional curiosity, leaning forward to examine the wings more closely. His expression was serious but not hostile, suggesting genuine interest in resolving the question of their legitimacy rather than simply supporting Morrison's security concerns. "These are unusual," Harwell said after several seconds of careful examination. "The craftsmanship is excellent, definitely not mass-produced or commercial. The design elements are unfamiliar, but the quality suggests they represent something significant." Morrison's expression showed slight frustration at Harwell's measured assessment. "But are they legitimate aviation credentials or not?" Dr. Harwell's careful examination of the wings had attracted additional attention from airport personnel. who'd been drawn by the developing security situation. A maintenance foreman, 2 gate agents, and an air traffic controller finishing his shift had gathered near the examination area, transforming what had begun as routine certification processing into public spectacle with an audience of aviation professionals. "Well," Morrison pressed, his patience clearly wearing thin as Harwell continued his detailed inspection. "Are they legitimate or not?" "I honestly can't identify the issuing organization," Harwell admitted, stepping back from his examination. With obvious frustration, "The design doesn't match any commercial, military, or civilian aviation insignia I've encountered in 12 years of flight instruction. The quality suggests authenticity, but without knowing the source." "So they could be fake," Morrison concluded, seizing on Harwell's uncertainty as confirmation of his suspicions. "Custom-made reproductions designed to look impressive to people who don't know better." The maintenance foreman, a grizzled veteran of 30 years in aviation operations, snorted with derision. "Wouldn't be the first time someone tried to impress people with bogus credentials. You can buy anything online these days, military patches, airline wings, even fake pilot certificates if you know where to look." One of the gate agents nodded in agreement. "We see it all the time with passengers trying to get cockpit tours or priority boarding. Flash some official-looking pins and hope nobody asks too many questions. Most people can't tell the difference between real aviation credentials and costume jewelry." The air traffic controller, still wearing his headset around his neck, studied Jenna with professional skepticism. "What I don't understand is why someone would wear questionable wings to an official examination. That's like bringing a fake ID to a police station. Either she's incredibly naive or she's betting that nobody here would recognize whatever those things are supposed to represent." "Maybe both," suggested Examiner Holbrook through the speaking grill, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd processed enough fraudulent applications to recognize the patterns. Persistence in the face of repeated failure often goes hand in hand with overconfidence in one's ability to deceive examining authorities. The young pilot candidate who'd been checking his watch earlier had positioned himself for a better view of the confrontation. "I heard about a guy who showed up to a commercial examination wearing captain stripes he'd bought at a uniform shop. Thought it would make him look more qualified. They banned him from testing for 2 years. "That's nothing," replied the woman, with flashcards, apparently feeling emboldened by the developing consensus about credential fraud. "My instructor told me about someone who claimed to have military helicopter experience, complete with fake service records. Turned out he'd never been in the military at all, just watched a lot of war movies and thought he could fake his way through the examination." The baseball cap man leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found his expertise suddenly relevant. "You can always tell the fake military pilots. They know all the jargon from movies and television, but they don't understand the actual procedures. Real military aviation is about precision and protocol, not Hollywood heroics." Morrison had heard enough amateur analysis. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice now carrying the finality of official judgment, "I'm going to need you to remove those wings immediately and provide proper identification of their origin, or I'll have to escort you from the building for misrepresentation of credentials in a federal aviation facility." The threat of forced removal represented the ultimate escalation, transforming credential questions into potential criminal charges. Federal aviation facilities operated under strict regulations about misrepresentation, and security chiefs had broad authority to remove anyone suspected of fraudulent activity. "She probably bought them at one of those military surplus stores," suggested another voice from the waiting area. "They sell all kinds of patches and pins to people who want to look like they've done things they've never actually done." "Stolen valor for aviators." "Worse than stolen valor," the maintenance foreman corrected with obvious disgust. "At least stolen valor usually involves real military insignia that meant something to somebody. This looks like completely made up." Credentials designed to fool people who don't know any better. Dr. Harwell, who'd been quietly studying the wings throughout the escalating commentary, finally spoke again. Chief Morrison, while I can't identify these specific wings, I have to say that the craftsmanship is extraordinary. If they're reproductions, they're the highest quality fake aviation insignia I've ever encountered. Quality fakes are still fakes, Morrison replied dismissively. And in my experience, people who invest in expensive reproductions are usually the ones most committed to deceiving others about their qualifications. The air traffic controller nodded in professional agreement. Makes sense. Someone spending serious money on fake credentials is planning to use them repeatedly, probably in multiple situations where they want to appear more qualified than they actually are. From behind the examination window, Holbrook shuffled papers with obvious impatience. Chief Morrison, given the irregularities in this candidate's documentation and the questions about credential authenticity, I think we can conclude this examination without proceeding to practical testing. 3 strikes. You're out. The bureaucratic pronouncement carried the weight of official finality, supported by security concerns and validated by multiple aviation professionals. Everyone in the room understood that they'd witnessed the end of someone's aviation dreams. Terminated not through examination failure, but through accusations of fraud and misrepresentation. Probably for the best, commented one of the waiting candidates. If she's willing to wear fake wings to an examination, what other corners has she been cutting in her training? Better to catch this kind of thing now than after she somehow gets certified and puts passengers at risk. That's exactly right, agreed the gate agent. Aviation safety depends on trust and honesty. If you can't trust someone to be honest about their credentials, how can you trust them with responsibility for other people's lives? The maintenance foreman shook his head with disgust. 30 years in this business, and I still can't understand. People who think they can fake their way into aviation. This isn't some desk job where you can learn as you go. When you're responsible for aircraft and passengers, competence isn't optional. Morrison stepped closer to Jenna, his hand moving to the radio on his belt in a gesture that suggested he was prepared to call for additional security personnel if she refused to comply with his demands. Last chance, Miss Caldwell. Remove those wings and leave the examination area voluntarily, or I'll have airport security escort you out with a notation in your file that will make future examination attempts significantly more difficult. The crowd of aviation professionals and waiting candidates had formed a loose semicircle around the confrontation, all of them watching with the fascinated attention of people witnessing a dramatic conclusion to the morning's entertainment. Nobody expected Jenna to have any reasonable response to the accumulated evidence of credential fraud and examination failure. The silence stretched across the lobby like the moment before impact, heavy with anticipation of surrender and the satisfaction of collective judgment validated. Everyone present understood that they were about to witness the final collapse of someone's aviation aspirations, terminated through their own poor choices and fraudulent behavior. Nobody in that room expected what was about to happen next. Main entrance to the Meridian Regional Aviation Authority building opened with its characteristic hydraulic sigh, letting in a brief gust of warm California air that carried the distant sound of aircraft engines and the smell of jet fuel from the active runway. The timing seemed almost theatrical, as if the building itself had decided that the morning's drama required a new participant. Captain Raymond Thorne stepped through the doorway with the quiet authority that came from 28 years of emergency aviation operations. Early 60s, silver hair cut with military precision, wearing the dark blue uniform of Emergency Response Command, with wings that every aviation professional in the room would immediately recognize as the real thing. His stride was measured and purposeful, the walk of someone who'd responded to countless situations where other people's emergencies became his. Professional responsibility. Thorne carried himself with the understated confidence of someone who'd earned his authority through competence rather than bureaucratic advancement. His uniform bore the minimal decorations of someone who'd been offered more recognition than he'd accepted, preferring substance over ceremony. The Emergency Response Command patch on his shoulder identified him as part of the elite aviation unit responsible for rescue operations, medical evacuations, and disaster response throughout the Pacific Northwest. His entrance initially went unnoticed by the crowd gathered around Jenna and Chief Morrison. The confrontation had reached such intensity that the arrival of another aviation professional seemed irrelevant to the immediate drama of credential fraud and examination failure. Everyone's attention remained focused on Morrison's ultimatum and Jenna's expected surrender. But Thorne's presence changed the atmospheric pressure of the room in ways that registered below conscious awareness. Conversations didn't stop immediately, but voices became slightly more subdued. Postures straightened imperceptibly as the kind of instinctive recognition that passed between people who'd operated in high-stakes environments activated unconscious responses to genuine authority. He paused just inside the entrance, his experienced eyes taking in the scene with the rapid assessment skills that emergency response work had honed to automatic precision. The crowd formation, the confrontational postures, the obvious power imbalance between a single individual and multiple authority figures, all patterns he'd encountered before in situations where official assumptions had diverged significantly. From operational reality, Thorne's gaze swept across the assembled aviation professionals, cataloging their credentials and experience levels through details that most people wouldn't notice. The maintenance foreman's 40-year service pin, the air traffic controller's facility certification badge, Dr. Harwell's instructor credentials, Chief Morrison's security authorization, all legitimate authority within their respective domains, but none with experience in the kind of aviation operations that Thorne supervised daily. When his eyes found Jenna, standing calmly in the center of the hostile crowd, something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the kind of recognition that occurred when pieces of a puzzle suddenly aligned in ways that made sense of previously confusing information. His stance changed subtly, from general observation to focused attention, the way emergency responders locked onto details that others missed. "Jenna Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lobby despite its conversational volume. The name wasn't a question or an announcement, just a statement of recognition that cut through the ongoing confrontation like a blade through fabric. The crowd's attention turned toward him with the kind of confusion that occurred when familiar scripts were interrupted by unexpected developments. Morrison paused in his ultimatum. Dr. Harwell stopped his continued examination of the wings, and the assembled audience of aviation professionals found themselves suddenly uncertain about what they were witnessing. "Captain Thorne," Jenna replied, her voice carrying the first note of warmth it had shown throughout the entire morning's proceedings. Not relief exactly, but acknowledgement of someone whose presence changed the fundamental dynamics of her situation. Thorne approached the group with the same measured pace he'd used entering the building, neither hurried nor hesitant, just the steady progression of someone who'd learned that most situations benefited from careful observation before action. His eyes moved briefly to Morrison's confrontational stance, then to the crowd of onlookers, then back to Jenna with an expression that suggested he was rapidly assembling a complete picture of what had been happening. "Didn't expect to find you here," Thorne said, stopping at conversational distance but positioning himself in a way that subtly shifted the power dynamics of the confrontation. His presence didn't directly challenge Morrison's authority, but it introduced a new variable. That changed everyone's calculations about how the situation might develop. "Third examination attempt," Jenna replied with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout the morning's escalating harassment. "Apparently there are some questions about my credentials." Thorne's expression showed no surprise at this information, but his eyes moved to the wings pinned to her jacket with the kind of focused attention that suggested he knew exactly what he was looking at. The brief examination lasted only seconds, but everyone watching understood that something significant had just occurred, even if they couldn't identify what it was. "Questions about her credentials?" Thorne asked, his tone carrying mild curiosity rather than challenge, but somehow managing to make Morrison's accusations seem less authoritative than they had moments before. Chief Morrison, who'd been building toward forcible removal of someone he'd identified as a security threat, found himself suddenly uncertain about how to proceed. Emergency Response Command carried federal authority that superseded local airport security, and Captain Thorne's obvious recognition of the suspect introduced complications that weren't covered in standard security protocols. "Captain Thorne," Morrison said, his voice now carrying the deference due to superior federal authority, "this individual has failed commercial pilot examination twice and is wearing unidentified aviation wings that she refuses to document properly. We have concerns about credential misrepresentation in a federal facility." Thorne nodded thoughtfully, as if Morrison's concerns deserved serious consideration, but his response carried undertones that suggested the situation might be more complex than it appeared. "And what did she tell you about those wings?" "Claims. They represent flight experience," Morrison replied, his confidence returning as he recounted the evidence that had led to his security concerns. "But she won't specify what kind of experience or provide documentation for verification. Dr. Harwell here examined them and couldn't identify the issuing organization." "Flight experience," Thorne repeated, his voice carrying a note that might have been amusement if the circumstances had been different. He looked back at Jenna with an expression that suggested they shared knowledge that others in the room lacked access to. Dr. Harwell, emboldened by the opportunity to demonstrate his expertise to genuine Federal Aviation Authority, stepped forward to offer his professional assessment. "Captain Thorne, I've been examining those wings for several minutes. The craftsmanship is excellent, but the design doesn't match any aviation insignia in my experience. If they're authentic, they represent something outside normal aviation certification channels." Thorne's attention shifted to Harwell with polite interest, but his response suggested that the flight instructor's expertise might not be as comprehensive as he'd assumed. "Dr. Harwell, how much experience do you have with emergency response aviation?" The question hung in the air with implications that everyone could sense, but nobody could quite articulate. Harwell's expression showed the first signs of uncertainty about his position in the developing conversation, as if he'd suddenly realized that his expertise might have significant gaps. Dr. Harwell's expression shifted from confident expertise to uncomfortable uncertainty as Captain Thorne's question about emergency response aviation experience hung in the air. "Well, I've taught emergency procedures in flight training," he replied, his voice carrying less authority than it had moments before. "Standard commercial aviation emergency protocols, of course." "Of course," Thorne acknowledged with professional courtesy, but something in his tone suggested that standard commercial procedures might not encompass the full spectrum of aviation emergency operations. "And Chief Morrison, what's your background with federal emergency response credentials?" Morrison's posture stiffened as he realized his authority was being questioned by someone with superior federal jurisdiction. "Airport security, sir. 15 years managing facility access and investigating credential irregularities. I'm trained to identify suspicious aviation documentation." "Suspicious documentation," Thorne repeated thoughtfully, his eyes moving back to the wings on Jenna's jacket. "Tell me, what makes those wings suspicious to you?" The question forced Morrison to articulate his concerns in front of federal authority, transforming what had been confident accusations into potentially questionable judgments. "They don't match any recognized aviation insignia, sir," Dr. Harwell confirmed that he couldn't identify the issuing organization, and the candidate refuses to provide proper documentation for verification. Thorne stepped closer to examine the wings himself, his movement deliberate and professional. The crowd watched with fascination as someone with obvious authority conducted his own assessment of the credentials they'd spent the morning denouncing as fraudulent. His examination was brief but thorough, taking in details that the others had missed or couldn't interpret properly. "These aren't commercial aviation wings," Thorne said after completing his inspection. His statement seemed to confirm Morrison's suspicions until he continued. "They're not military either, at least not in the conventional sense." The maintenance foreman, who'd been quietly observing the federal intervention, decided to contribute his 3 decades of aviation experience to the discussion. "Captain, if they're not commercial or military, what else could they be? In my experience, legitimate aviation credentials come from recognized organizations with proper documentation procedures." Thorne's response carried the patience of someone explaining complex concepts to people with limited context. "Your experience is valuable within commercial aviation operations, but emergency response work operates under different authorization structures. We deal with situations that don't always fit standard certification categories." The air traffic controller, still wearing his headset around his neck, leaned forward with professional curiosity. "Are you saying those wings represent some kind of specialized emergency response qualification?" "I'm saying," Thorne replied carefully, "that not all aviation expertise appears in databases that commercial examiners typically access. Some operations require personnel who work outside normal certification channels." Behind the examination window, Examiner Holbrook had been listening to the developing conversation with growing confusion. Her world of federal aviation regulations and standardized procedures didn't include provisions for credentials that existed outside normal documentation requirements. "Captain Thorne," she called through the speaking grill, "are you suggesting that this candidate has valid aviation qualifications that aren't reflected in standard FAA records?" Thorne turned toward the examination window with the expression of someone choosing his words carefully. "Examiner Holbrook, how familiar are you with Emergency Response Command operations?" "I process standard commercial pilot certifications." Holbrook replied defensively. "Emergency response falls under different regulatory authority." "Different regulatory authority," Thorne confirmed. "Which means different documentation procedures, different qualification standards, and different oversight mechanisms. What looks irregular to commercial aviation might be perfectly standard in emergency operations." The young pilot candidate who'd been checking his watch earlier raised his hand tentatively, as if requesting permission to speak in a classroom. "Captain, are you saying she's qualified for commercial aviation even though she failed the examinations?" Thorne's answer revealed the complexity that commercial aviation professionals rarely encountered. "I'm saying that examination procedures designed for standard commercial operations might not accurately assess capabilities developed through emergency response work. Different skill sets, different evaluation criteria." Dr. Harwell, still trying to maintain his position as aviation expert, despite the gaps in his knowledge becoming apparent, pressed for clarification. "But surely any legitimate aviation qualification would be recognizable to flight instructors and examiners." "We're trained to evaluate pilot competency across all aviation disciplines." "Are you?" Thorne asked with mild curiosity. "How many emergency rescue operations have you participated in? How many medical evacuations under hostile weather conditions? How many disaster response flights into areas with no established landing zones?" The questions exposed the limitations of commercial aviation training in ways that made everyone in the room suddenly aware of how narrow their expertise might be. Harwell's silence provided its own answer about the scope of his actual experience. Beyond classroom instruction and standard flight training, Morrison, who'd been growing increasingly uncomfortable as his security concerns were reframed as jurisdictional misunderstandings, decided to reassert his authority. "Captain, regardless of specialized qualifications, we still have facility security requirements. If those wings can't be verified through standard channels, they present a potential security risk. Thorne nodded with understanding while simultaneously undermining Morrison's position. Chief Morrison, you're absolutely right about security requirements. That's why Emergency Response Command maintains its own verification procedures for personnel operating in federal facilities. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew a secure communication device that everyone recognized as far more sophisticated than standard airport security equipment. Would you like me to verify Miss Caldwell's authorization through proper federal channels? The offer transformed the situation from credential investigation to federal verification process, shifting authority from local airport security to Federal Emergency Response Command. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of either accepting federal verification or challenging federal authority in a federal facility. Of course, sir, Morrison replied, though his tone suggested he was no longer confident about the outcome of verification procedures he didn't control or understand. Thorne activated the communication device with practiced efficiency, connecting to databases and authorization systems that operated at classification levels far above commercial aviation security. The brief conversation that followed was conducted in aviation terminology that mixed standard flight operations with emergency response codes that the listening audience couldn't interpret. Verification complete, Thorne announced after ending the secure communication. His expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching satisfaction, as if the verification had confirmed information he'd already known but couldn't discuss without proper authorization. And Morrison prompted, though his voice suggested he was no longer certain he wanted to hear the answer. Thorne looked around the assembled crowd of aviation professionals, airport security, and examination candidates, all of whom had spent the morning making assumptions about someone they'd never bothered to understand. Miss Caldwell's emergency response authorization is current and valid. Her qualifications exceed the requirements for commercial aviation in several specialized categories. The statement hit the crowd like turbulence in clear skies, sudden and disorienting. Everything they'd assumed about credential fraud and examination failure was being systematically dismantled by someone with authority. They couldn't question an access to information they couldn't verify. But Thorne wasn't finished. His expression suggested that verification of her current status was just the beginning of information that would redefine everyone's understanding of who Jenna Caldwell actually was. The silence that followed Thorne's verification stretched across the lobby like the moment before impact, heavy with the weight of collapsed assumptions and the growing realization that everyone present had fundamentally misunderstood the morning's events. The maintenance foreman shifted uncomfortably in his position. The air traffic controller removed his headset completely, and Dr. Harwell studied his shoes with the intensity of someone discovering their limitations in real time. Thorne looked around the assembled crowd with the expression of someone deciding how much classified information could be revealed in a public setting. His next words would either satisfy their curiosity or leave them with more questions than answers. But either way, they would understand exactly why Jenna Caldwell deserved their respect rather than their ridicule. 6 weeks ago, Thorne began, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone delivering an operational briefing. Transwest Flight 847 departed Seattle-Tacoma International Airport bound for San Francisco with 200 passengers and crew aboard. Standard commercial flight, routine weather conditions, experienced crew with over 40,000 combined flight hours. The specificity of his information caught everyone's attention. This wasn't general discussion about emergency procedures. This was detailed knowledge about a specific incident that had clearly required Emergency Response Command involvement. 43 minutes into the flight, at 35,000 feet over the Cascade Mountains, the aircraft encountered what meteorologists later classified as an unprecedented weather system. Severe clear air turbulence combined with rapidly developing microbursts. That appeared without warning on any radar system. Dr. Harwell looked up from his examination of his shoes, professional curiosity overcoming his embarrassment. Clear air turbulence at that altitude usually isn't severe enough to threaten aircraft integrity. What made this system different? Wind shear gradients of over 120 knots within vertical distances of less than 500 feet. Thorne replied with the precision of someone who'd reviewed every detail of the meteorological analysis, combined with downdrafts exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. The kind of conditions that turn routine flights into survival situations. The air traffic controller whistled softly, understanding the implications in ways that the others might not. At those gradients, even experienced crews would have trouble maintaining control. Did they declare an emergency? They tried, Thorne continued. But the same atmospheric conditions that created the turbulence also disrupted radio communications. For 18 minutes, Flight 847 was effectively cut off from ground control, fighting weather that exceeded the design limitations of commercial aircraft, while unable to communicate their situation or receive assistance. Morrison, who'd been quietly processing the implications of federal verification, found his voice again. "Captain, what does this have to do with Miss Caldwell's examination situation?" Thorne's expression suggested that Morrison was about to understand the connection in ways that would make his earlier security concerns seem absurdly misplaced. Chief Morrison, Flight 847's captain, was Robert Chun, 30-year veteran with over 25,000 flight hours. His first officer was Maria Santos, 15 years experience, former Air Force transport pilot. Both excellent aviators with spotless safety records. The maintenance foreman nodded with professional respect. Experienced crew. They should have been able to handle severe weather if anyone could. Under normal circumstances, yes, Thorne agreed. But these weren't normal circumstances. The turbulence damaged the aircraft's primary flight control systems. Hydraulic failures, electrical malfunctions, navigation equipment offline. Captain Chun found himself trying to control a partially disabled aircraft in the worst weather conditions any of them had ever encountered. Behind the examination window, Examiner Holbrook had stopped all pretense of processing other paperwork to listen to Thorne's account. How did they manage to land safely? Emergency procedures for that level of system failure are extremely complex. They didn't land safely, Thorne said quietly. Captain Chun made the decision to attempt an emergency landing at the nearest suitable airport, Cascade Regional, a smaller facility with shorter runways and minimal emergency equipment. But by the time they reached the area, the weather system had intensified further. The young pilot candidate who'd been checking his watch raised his hand tentatively. Did they make it to the airport? The first approach was aborted due to crosswinds exceeding aircraft limitations. The second approach had to be abandoned when wind shear threw the aircraft off the glide path just 200 feet above the runway. By the third approach attempt, fuel was becoming critical and weather conditions were beyond anything commercial aviation procedures are designed to handle. Thorne paused, allowing the severity of the situation to register with his audience. Everyone in the room understood enough about aviation to know that multiple aborted approaches in severe weather with fuel running low represented a nightmare scenario for any flight crew. That's when Emergency Response Command received authorization to deploy specialized assistance, Thorne continued. The situation had moved beyond commercial aviation protocols into disaster response territory. We needed someone who could operate in conditions that would ground normal flight operations. Dr. Harwell's expression showed growing comprehension of where this account was leading. Someone with emergency response qualifications rather than standard commercial certification. Someone with experience flying in hostile conditions without reliable navigation equipment, Thorne confirmed. Someone who demonstrated the ability to make decisions under extreme pressure when standard procedures no longer applied. Someone who could take control of the situation that had exceeded the training parameters of even highly experienced commercial pilots. The maintenance foreman looked toward Jenna with the first signs of understanding. "You're saying she was involved in the rescue operation?" "I'm saying," Thorne replied with the satisfaction of someone revealing long overdue recognition, "that Jenna Caldwell took control of Transwest Flight 847 during its final approach and landed it safely at Cascade Regional Airport under conditions that aviation meteorologists are still studying because they represent the most severe weather ever successfully navigated by commercial aircraft." The statement hit the assembled crowd like a physical force, redefining everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who'd been sitting patiently through hours of dismissive commentary and bureaucratic harassment. The implications cascaded through their understanding like dominoes falling in sequence. "She wasn't a passenger," the air traffic controller said, his voice carrying amazement as the reality of the situation became clear. "She was the pilot who brought them down." Emergency Response Command authorization allows qualified personnel to assume control of commercial aircraft during disaster situations, Thorne explained. Captain Chen, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond his experience level, made the decision to transfer aircraft control to specialized rescue operations. It was the right call. Morrison, who'd spent the morning questioning her credentials, now understood that he'd been investigating someone whose aviation qualifications far exceeded his ability to evaluate them. 200 passengers? 214 people. Total, Thorne confirmed, including crew and 3 infants who weren't included in the passenger manifest. Every single person aboard that aircraft owes their life to the decision-making and flying ability of the woman you've been accusing of credential fraud. The silence that followed carried the weight of collective recognition that they'd spent hours misjudging someone whose actions had saved more lives than most pilots would encounter in entire careers. The morning's entertainment had transformed into a lesson about the dangers of making assumptions based on incomplete information. Thorne wasn't finished with his revelation. His expression suggested that the successful landing was only part of a story that would make their misjudgments even more profound. The atmospheric pressure in the lobby shifted as fundamentally as if the building's ventilation system had been recalibrated for an entirely different purpose. The fluorescent lights continued their eternal buzz. The air conditioning maintained its wheeling cycle, and the same institutional beige walls surrounded the same orange plastic chairs, but the space itself had been transformed by the weight of revealed truth into something approaching a shrine. Chief Morrison was the first to move, his hand dropping away from his radio with the slow motion of someone whose entire understanding of authority had just been reconstructed. The security concerns that had driven his confrontational approach evaporated like morning fog, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he'd spent an hour threatening to remove someone who'd accomplished more in 6 weeks than he'd manage in his entire career. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a formality that bordered on reverence, "I owe you an apology. I had no idea." The sentence trailed off because there were no words adequate to address the magnitude of his misjudgment. How do you apologize to someone for questioning their right to exist in a space when they'd proven themselves capable of saving hundreds of lives? Dr. Harwell stood with the careful movement of someone whose professional confidence had been systematically dismantled and was now attempting to reassemble itself around an entirely new framework of understanding. His examination of the wings on Jenna's jacket took on new meaning. He'd been studying credentials that represented achievement far beyond anything covered in his 12 years of flight instruction. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his academic authority replaced by genuine humility, "those wings, they represent the Cascade Regional landing?" The question carried the weight of someone trying to understand symbols that existed outside his previous experience, markers of accomplishment that couldn't be found in any textbook or certification manual. Jenna nodded once, the same economical movement she'd used throughout the morning's proceedings. Nothing in her demeanor had changed, no vindication, no satisfaction at watching her accusers realize their mistakes, just the same composed presence that had characterized her behavior when everyone thought she was a fraud. The maintenance foreman removed his baseball cap with the unconscious respect that working people showed in the presence of genuine heroism. 30 years in aviation had taught him to recognize competence, but he'd never encountered someone whose competence had translated into saving lives on the scale that Thorne had just described. 214 people, he said, his voice carrying wonder at the magnitude of what she'd accomplished. I've been around aviation my whole life, and I've never heard of anyone successfully landing a disabled commercial aircraft in those conditions. The skill level required ... He shook his head, unable to complete the thought because his experience provided no reference point for what she'd achieved. Behind the examination window, Examiner Holbrook sat staring at her computer screen as if the database might suddenly reveal information that had been hidden moments before. Her world of standardized procedures and regulatory compliance had no framework for evaluating someone whose qualifications exceeded the measurement capabilities of commercial aviation systems. "Miss Caldwell," she called through the speaking grill, her voice stripped of the bureaucratic authority that had characterized their earlier interaction. "Your certification application. I need to reconsider the evaluation procedures. Standard commercial examination protocols don't seem adequate for assessing someone with your background." The air traffic controller, still processing the implications of what he'd learned, stepped closer with the reverence of someone approaching sacred ground. "The communication blackout during the landing, you brought them down without ground control guidance? In those weather conditions? Emergency procedures." Jenna replied with the same professional composure she'd maintained throughout the morning. "Standard protocols for situations beyond normal air traffic control parameters." "Standard for you, maybe," the controller said with genuine awe. "For the rest of us, those are nightmare scenarios that we hope never to encounter." 80 minutes. Without communication during a disaster landing. Most pilots would panic just thinking about it. The young pilot candidate who'd been checking his watch obsessively found himself staring at Jenna with the expression of someone encountering a living legend. His upcoming commercial examination suddenly seemed trivial compared to the kind of aviation challenges she'd mastered. How do you learn to fly in conditions like that? Is there training for emergency response operations? "Years of preparation," Captain Thorne answered for her. "Specialized training that most commercial pilots never encounter because they never need to operate outside normal parameters." Miss Caldwell's qualifications represent a level of aviation expertise that exists specifically for situations where standard procedures fail. The gate agents who joined the morning's commentary now stood silently near the bulletin board, their casual dismissals of her competence transformed into embarrassed recognition of their own ignorance. They'd spent careers processing passengers on routine flights, never imagining they might encounter someone who'd saved more lives in a single operation than they'd facilitate in decades of normal service. The woman with flashcards, who'd been memorizing commercial aviation regulations, looked down at her study materials with the recognition that textbook knowledge had severe limitations when confronted with real-world crisis management. The federal aviation regulations she'd been cramming seemed inadequate for addressing the kind of situations where lives depended on capabilities that couldn't be measured through standardized testing. "The wings," Dr. Harwell said again, his academic curiosity overcoming his embarrassment. "They're awarded for specific rescue operations? Recognition for service beyond normal duty requirements," Thorne explained. "Emergency Response Command doesn't issue decorative awards. Those wings represent documented achievement in situations where failure would have resulted in significant loss of life." Morrison, who'd built a career on identifying security threats, now understood that he'd been investigating someone whose security clearance probably exceeded his own authority to question. Captain Thorne, should I have been able to identify Emergency Response Command credentials through standard verification procedures? Chief Morrison, your security protocols are designed for commercial aviation operations, Thorne replied with professional understanding. Emergency response credentials operate at classification levels that aren't accessible through normal facility security systems. You couldn't have known. The maintenance foreman replaced his baseball cap with slow deliberation, the gesture of someone whose worldview had been permanently altered by new information. Ma'am, I want to apologize for what we said earlier. We had no right to judge your qualifications without understanding what you'd accomplished. No apology necessary, Jenna replied, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy she'd shown throughout the morning's harassment. Most people don't encounter emergency response operations in normal aviation work. But her forgiveness only highlighted the magnitude of grace she was extending to people who'd spent hours questioning her competence and character. The contrast between their behavior and hers created an atmosphere of collective shame that was almost palpable in the institutional air of the lobby. The silence that followed wasn't the hostile quiet that had preceded Thorne's arrival, but the contemplative hush of people processing information that challenged their fundamental assumptions about competence, recognition, and the relationship between official credentials and actual achievement. They'd learned that heroism didn't always announce itself, that expertise didn't always conform to standard certification procedures, and that respect was something you withheld at your own peril. Examiner Holbrook's voice cut through the contemplative silence with the efficiency of someone who'd found a way forward through bureaucratic confusion. Miss Caldwell, I'm going to recommend that your application be processed through specialized evaluation procedures. Commercial certification seems inadequate for someone with your qualifications. The transformation was complete. The morning's entertainment had become an education. The object of ridicule had become a figure of respect, and the bureaucratic rejection had become institutional recognition of extraordinary competence. But throughout it all, Jenna Caldwell remained exactly who she'd been when she'd first walked through the door, professional, composed, and focused on completing her mission, regardless of what anyone else thought about her right to be there. Jenna gathered her worn leather portfolio with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the morning's proceedings, her movements unhurried despite the fundamental transformation that had occurred in the lobby around her. The paperwork that had been questioned, dismissed, and nearly rejected now carried the weight of documentation supporting someone whose qualifications exceeded the measuring capabilities of standard aviation bureaucracy. Examiner Holbrook worked with newfound efficiency behind her reinforced glass barrier, processing forms with the careful attention of someone who understood that she was handling the certification of someone whose competence had already been proven under circumstances that most pilots would never encounter. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with respect rather than skepticism, each keystroke acknowledging expertise that couldn't be captured in databases designed for conventional aviation careers. Miss Caldwell, Holbrook called through the speaking grill, her voice carrying the deference due to someone whose achievements had redefined the morning's understanding of professional aviation. Your commercial certification will be processed through expedited procedures. Emergency Response Command endorsement supersedes standard evaluation requirements. The bureaucratic language translated to recognition that someone who'd successfully landed a disabled aircraft with 214 lives aboard had already demonstrated competencies far beyond anything measurable through routine examination procedures. The third attempt that had begun with skepticism would conclude with acknowledgement of qualifications that exceeded commercial aviation standards. Captain Thorne approached Jenna with the professional respect that passed between people who'd operated in spaces where decisions carried life or death consequences. Still planning to pursue commercial certification? He asked, though his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than questioning her judgment. The mission requires it, Jenna replied with characteristic understatement. The response revealed something fundamental about her approach to professional development, not driven by personal ambition or external validation, but by operational requirements that served purposes larger than individual recognition. Emergency Response Command could always use additional qualified personnel, Thorne offered. Specialized operations, federal authority, situations where standard procedures don't apply. Jenna considered the suggestion with the same careful assessment she'd brought to every interaction throughout the morning. Commercial certification first, she decided. Then we'll see what missions develop. Chief Morrison, who'd spent the morning building a security case against someone whose clearance levels probably exceeded his authority to question, stepped forward with the humility of someone whose expertise had been revealed as fundamentally limited. Miss Caldwell, I want you to know that your credentials will be flagged in our system as Emergency Response Command authorized. No future questioning of your qualifications. The gesture represented more than bureaucratic efficiency. It was institutional recognition that some achievements couldn't be evaluated through standard security protocols, and that competence sometimes existed in forms that challenged conventional verification procedures. Dr. Harwell approached with academic curiosity, tempered by newfound respect for expertise that extended far beyond classroom instruction. Would you be willing to speak to my aviation students about emergency response operations? I think they need to understand that aviation encompasses more than commercial certification procedures. If scheduling permits, Jenna agreed, though her tone suggested that educational opportunities would be evaluated according to the same mission-focused criteria that govern her other professional decisions. The maintenance foreman, whose 30 years in aviation had been redefined by encountering someone whose achievements dwarfed his accumulated experience, removed his baseball cap again with unconscious respect. Ma'am, I just want to say that people like you are the reason the rest of us can do our jobs safely. Knowing that there are pilots out there who can handle the impossible situations, it makes a difference. His words carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades supporting aviation operations, without ever imagining he might encounter one of the people who responded when those operations exceeded normal parameters. The recognition was personal, rather than professional, human rather than bureaucratic. The young pilot candidate, whose commercial examination anxieties had been overshadowed by witnessing genuine aviation heroism, approached with the reverence of someone encountering a living example of what professional competence could achieve. Miss Caldwell, what advice would you give to someone just starting in aviation? Jenna's response reflected the same practical wisdom that had characterized her behavior throughout the morning's proceedings. Master the fundamentals completely. When emergency situations develop, you'll need every basic skill to be automatic so you can focus on the problems that don't have standard solutions. The advice carried implications that extended beyond aviation into any profession where competence could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Excellence in basics created the foundation for handling situations that challenged conventional expertise. As Jenna walked toward the exit, her progress was accompanied by a silence that differed fundamentally from the hostile quiet that had greeted her arrival. This was the contemplative hush of people processing lessons that would influence their future interactions with colleagues, candidates, and anyone whose qualifications might not be immediately apparent through conventional evaluation methods. Door closed behind her with the same hydraulic sigh that had marked Captain Thorne's entrance, but the building she left behind had been permanently altered by the morning's events. Not in any visible way, the fluorescent lights continued their eternal buzz. The orange plastic chairs remained uncomfortable, and the institutional beige walls showed no evidence of transformation. But the people who worked in that space would approach future certification candidates differently. Understanding that competence sometimes wore civilian clothes and carried worn portfolios, that expertise didn't always announce itself through obvious credentials. And that respect was something you earned through accurate judgment rather than bureaucratic authority. The lesson extended beyond aviation into fundamental questions about recognition, assumption, and the relationship between appearance and reality. They'd learned that heroes don't always look like movie casting directors might suggest, that quiet confidence often runs deeper than loud proclamations, and that the most impressive achievements sometimes occur without fanfare or publicity. In the months that followed, the story of Jenna Caldwell's morning at the Meridian Regional Aviation Authority would be retold in break rooms and training facilities throughout the regional aviation community. Not as entertainment, but as education about the invisible infrastructure of competence that keeps complex systems functioning safely. Some stories change behavior without requiring acknowledgement, shift perspectives without demanding recognition, and make the world incrementally better through the simple act of revealing truth to people who need to understand it. The morning's events had been that kind of story, the kind that influences how people treat the next quiet professional who walks through their doors carrying credentials that don't conform to standard expectations. And somewhere in the regional aviation system, Jenna Caldwell continued her work with the same composed competence she displayed throughout her bureaucratic ordeal, carrying the knowledge that 214 people owed their lives to capabilities that couldn't be measured through routine examination. Procedures, flying missions that would never appear in commercial aviation databases, wearing wings that represented achievements most pilots could never imagine. The quiet heroes who keep the world functioning rarely receive public recognition for their service. But occasionally, in spaces like bureaucratic lobbies where assumptions meet reality, their true worth is revealed to people who desperately need to understand the difference between official credentials and actual competence. Have you ever encountered someone whose quiet competence exceeded their official recognition? What would you do if someone you'd dismissed surprised you with extraordinary achievement? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single response, and they help us understand which stories of unrecognized heroism matter most. To our aviation community, hit that like button if this reminded you that real expertise doesn't always announce itself loudly. Subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss these powerful stories about the pilots who save lives while working outside the spotlight. Share this with someone who needs to understand that genuine heroes often wear civilian clothes and carry worn portfolios instead of impressive uniforms and polished credentials. Another story of quiet courage that happens away from the cameras is waiting for you right now. Click that next video and discover more heroes hiding in plain sight, working missions that make the difference between safety and disaster for everyone who depends on professional aviation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.